the distributor did not make any profits, zero. And now he has the ability to de-risk himself and get a steady return. But what happens to a distributor where, let's say a distributor was earning a 5% margin in the past, and past 5 years show that his margin fluctuated between +5 and +10. And then the parent company says that, look, you have been profitable in the past, but this is how we see the competitive scenario in India changing. This is how we see regulations changing. So your past conduct of earning 5 to 10% is not an indicator for the future. Things are going to change in the Indian market. You earn 5 to 10% in the past, but you may not earn 5 to 10% in the future. And therefore, why don't you restructure? I'll give you a 2% return. I take the risk. Now, this is an extremely complex situation because conduct would show that that distributor actually was profitable in the past, 5 to 10%. But earning past profits is no guarantee that that is going to continue in the future. And there you will have to significantly document these first 3 bullets. That, what were the options that were realistically available to him before and after the restructuring, and so on and so forth. There is also elaborate discussion in the OECD guidelines on indemnification of the restructured entity for termination or substantial renegotiation of existing contracts. Now again, the principles here are exactly the same. It's just that these kind of arrangements are very difficult to identify in real life because contracts do undergo lots of changes, and the question there is that as an outcome of those changes, is profit potential really moving out? And here the starting point to the inquiry is that does the contract in its present form have a termination clause? Okay. Because under arm's length, independent third parties would usually have a termination clause built into the contract. And it's quite obvious. So I'll give you an example of a contract manufacturing entity. And this also happens between real life situations. And I will talk about 1 or 2 published news items which came into the press without getting into whether those situations are right or wrong, but these are actually litigation which happened between third parties. So let's take the case of a contract manufacturing entity, okay? A contract manufacturing entity, let's say, is manufacturing goods only for the export market. So the contract manufacturer is earning a cost plus 10% return for contract manufacturing. The foreign company to whom the contract manufacturer is supplying says that, look, you are buying 80% of your raw material requirement from me. So your cost includes raw materials that you are procuring from me itself. Then you convert that into a finished formulation. And then you sell the finished formulation back to me. And then you earn a 10% markup on your total cost, which includes the cost of raw materials that you are buying from me. Now here is a situation which is akin to, let's say, a situation where you go to a tailor and you give him a fabric. Should the tailor really earn a profit on your fabric? Okay. So the foreign company says that I have given you my raw material. Why should I allow you to make a profit on my raw material itself? I will give you a profit on your conversion cost. So the foreign company says that, look, I want you to restructure. I will give you raw materials free of cost from tomorrow. So you will not incur a cost. I'm buying the raw material, I'm giving it to you free of cost. You will, from tomorrow onwards, earn a return on conversion cost. Okay. Now, the issue here is that, is this first of all a restructuring arrangement? There is immense commercial sense if you really look at it. Okay. So here, the point here is that as a contract manufacturer, that entity did not really have any intangible assets because he was getting technological know-how from the customer. He was using that know-how to manufacture. That know-how was not his own know-how. Okay, so he did not have any technology assets. He did not have any brands or trademarks because he was a captive contract manufacturer. डिजाइन लेता था, मैन्युफैक्चर करता था, फिर कस्टमर का ब्रांड फिक्स करके he would sell. So those brands and trademarks did not belong to him. He had no interface with third-party customers, and therefore he did not create or own any intangible assets. Now, optically, it would seem that this kind of a contract manufacturer if the customer says that tomorrow I will convert you into a toll manufacturer, should not be compensated with a one-time return because he never owned or created any intangible assets. And therefore, the contract manufacturer has two options. Option one is to agree to the restructuring. And option two is to not agree to the restructuring, in which case he stands the risk that the customer will terminate his contract and his entire investment in plant and machinery which he did will go waste. Correct? Now, how would independent third parties behave in a situation like this? In a situation like this, the way independent third parties would behave is that they would usually document a termination clause in the contract manufacturing agreement. So if the contract manufacturer has invested significant amounts of money to create certain infrastructure, let's say he put up a 300 crore plant, then there will be a termination clause in the agreement which will say that you cannot terminate my agreement for the next 5 years till such time that I earn a return on capital employed on 300 crores. Okay? And if in this type of a situation, if the termination were to happen, then obviously the foreign company will have to compensate. There was something like this which actually happened in real life. It came in the papers some 6-8 months ago. I do not know what is the current status of this litigation, but it came in the papers. Procter & Gamble had a contract manufacturing arrangement with a third party called JHS Svengard, and P&G decided to terminate that arrangement, and Svengard sued them. And they said that you have to compensate us. And P&G said that we terminated your agreement because your quality was not good. And Svengard said that my quality was good and I have invested this plant only for you and therefore you better pay up. Now, who was right, who was wrong is not for us to question. The only limited point that I want to make here is that this is a situation where the termination clause, if had it been very strongly written in their agreement, there would not have been any cause for dispute. So the first point of inquiry is whether the agreement that is terminated, renewed or renegotiated provides for an indemnification clause. The second point is that whether that indemnification clause itself is arm's length. Okay, so let's take the case of a distributor, and let's assume here is a distributor who's positioned as a risk-bearing distributor, and that risk-bearing distributor, let's say that risk-bearing distributor, it has invested significant amounts of monies to develop the market and to create some intangibles. So let's take an example of, let's say, a Big Bazaar. Okay, this is just a hypothetical example. Now, if you look at the arrangement that a Big Bazaar will have with a FMCG company like, let's say, Unilever or P&G or whoever else, or Cadbury's, for example. Big Bazaar is an entrepreneurial retailer. Okay, so they are not related to each other, right? So the way transfer pricing between these two third parties would have been arranged is that, let's assume Cadbury's would say that you are a retailer, my MRP of a bar of chocolate is 100 rupees, your gross profit margin is say 40 rupees, therefore I will sell this bar of chocolate to you for 60 rupees. Okay, so 40 rupees is your margin. Now, in that 40 rupees, Big Bazaar as an entrepreneurial retailer decides to invest in infrastructure, so they set up all these retail stores around the country. And those retail stores, the number of footfalls is significantly high. So that's the intangible that they have created, that they have an assured line of customers, and so many customers visit the store. Now, in this type of a situation, if, let's say, Cadbury's decides that tomorrow we do not want to stock our chocolates with Big Bazaar, we want to stock our chocolates with Reliance Fresh, we will terminate this arrangement. Would it not be natural for Big Bazaar to say to Cadbury's that, look, I invested all of this for you, and now how can you terminate this arrangement? What happens to the reward? Now again, whether a compensation should be due or not depends on so many things. One is that was that investment specifically made to serve only one customer? And if it was made to serve only one customer, That investment could be in the form of capital infrastructure, it could be in the form of a distribution network, it could be in any form. But was that investment specifically made for a principle? Okay. And did the transfer pricing policy in place, which is the 40% GP, did it provide an ability to the distributor stroke retailer to actually earn a return on his investment? So if you can show that, look, this 40% was set in such a way, and the budgets of the company showed that if the gross profit margin was 40%, then over a period of time, Big Bazaar would recoup its investment cost and earn a margin on top of it, and therefore the 40% transfer price adequately rewarded the distributor for all these functions, then the answer would be that, even if some intangibles were created, those were adequately compensated ab initio by the other side, and therefore no compensation should be due. So this is something, again, is a question of how independent third parties write their agreements. In these kind of arrangements, we have in the past done extensive research on public agreements, which are often enclosed as part of SEC filings, for example, to see where independent third parties terminate contracts or renegotiate contracts, whether those agreements provide for a termination clause, and what do those termination clauses really say. In many countries around the world, indemnification rights are provided by statute. Now in India, under the Contract Act or Specific Reliefs Act, we don't have specific mandatory indemnification provisions in terms of what happens when agreements are terminated. But in many countries around the world, like for example in Germany, there are indemnification provisions that when you terminate the contract of a commissioner or a distributor, you have to reward that entity in a certain way. So if those kind of statutes or laws exist in those countries, then those will also have to be seen, because they will determine the extent of indemnification that is required. And last point, whether at arm's length another party would have been willing to indemnify the one that suffers from the termination or renegotiation of the agreement. Now this again, the last bullet goes back to the previous slide, clearly. And the point that I'm trying to simply emphasize is that when you are looking at substantial renegotiation of existing contracts, principles are not different. It's the same principle. And you have to independently show that that renegotiation or termination, whether it satisfies the test of arm's length or not. Part 3 of OECD deals with remuneration for post-restructuring control transactions. I'm going to go a little fast from here because we have only 15 minutes left, so I'll try to cover things which are more relevant. Now here, I don't want to get into this thing on what is the difference between restructuring as opposed to structuring. The only limited difference is that in a structuring exercise, there is no reallocation of functions, assets, and risks. And transactions are structured ab initio to carry, certain amount of functions or bear certain amount of risks. That's the only difference. And again, the arm's length standard would require satisfaction of the same tests. In other words, are you allocating risks to the entity which has control over those risks? Are you allocating risks to the entity which has the financial capacity to bear those risks? So whether it is a restructuring arrangement or a structuring arrangement, the same tests apply. Okay. But once you have restructured an arrangement, and let's assume you go through this entire phase of evaluating whether the restructuring is arm's length, deciding whether a one-time compensation is required or not required, valuing that compensation, and then exchanging that compensation, and then offering that compensation to tax in some way. So you've done all of that. Now you are in a stage where you are in a post restructuring situation. Now in a post restructuring situation, you have to assign reward to the post restructured functions, assets, and risks. And there again, in transfer pricing, your functional analysis comes into play. Wherefore, the right set of functions, assets, and risks, you will assign the right reward. Just to take an example of the contract manufacturer that I spoke earlier, let's assume you are a contract manufacturer earlier, and the parent company says that, look, I'm supplying you raw materials. Why should I give you a profit margin on my own raw materials? So I want to convert you into a toller. So you do all of that, right? And then after you are restructured, the contract manufacturer is operating like a toll manufacturer. So he buys he gets raw materials free of cost, he converts them, and then just gets conversion charges as opposed to a transfer price. In this situation, the Indian contract manufacturer no longer has title to inventory, right? And therefore the Indian contract manufacturer should not be seen to be undertaking inventory management functions and procurement functions. Okay? And this goes back to the first point that I made, that you have to assess what has changed. If in a hypothetical scenario, the contract manufacturer continues to control or exercise control over inventory, continues to carry on procurement functions without taking title, then tax authorities will not respect this. Okay? So, assuming for a moment that the toll manufacturer has conduct which is actually that of a toll manufacturer, he has no control over inventory and consequently does not have inventory management functions, he is not responsible for procurement and those functions are assumed by somebody else, then his role is just that of a job worker. And therefore, as a job worker, you will have to assign a reward which is similar to what other job workers earn. Now that reward could be a combination of a cost plus on conversion cost, but it's always a better practice to combine that with some kind of analysis on what is the return on capital employed earned by job workers. Because at the end of the day, you have invested in plant and machinery. The plant and machinery still belongs to you. Whether that cost plus gives you a right return on capital employed or not is something that also needs to be looked at properly. Location savings, I'm not going to go into this point on location savings because there is significant amount of theory on this issue by itself. The only reason why I have mentioned it over here is very often in a restructuring exercise, functions are relocated from high cost jurisdictions to low cost jurisdictions. And sometimes these functions are relocated to achieve economies of scale and for cost reduction purposes. And in such kind of situations, whether the entity to which the function has got relocated, if that entity is situated in a low-cost jurisdiction, and as a result of using that entity, the foreign company earns a cost saving, the question is, who does that cost saving really belong to? Does that belong to the Indian entity, or does that belong to the foreign entity, or should it be shared? So that's the issue of location savings. The only reason why I'm mentioning it is because location savings as an issue can arise as an outcome of a relocation that happens in a business restructuring exercise. In fact, before the OECD came out with its own draft on intangibles, the only area in the OECD guidelines which talked of location savings was Chapter 9. And then you had consultants who started arguing that, look, location savings is relevant only in the case of business restructuring, otherwise it is not relevant at all. OECD has now clarified that to say that the issue of relocation was relevant to a restructuring and therefore location savings was discussed in the context of restructuring. So that does not mean that the issue does not arise in other situations. So they now clarified that in the intangibles draft. Recognition of actual transactions undertaken. Now, this is extremely important section of the OECD guidelines, which talks about in what situations the tax authorities can simply disregard a transaction as opposed to respecting it. And OECD cautions that disregarding a transaction should be reserved to only exceptional circumstances. Okay, and by and large, if the tax authorities believe that the transaction is not conducted in an arm's length way, they should seek to reprice the transaction as opposed to disregarding it altogether. So what are the principles around this? The first principle around this is that does the economic substance of the transaction, is it really aligned with the conduct of the parties? So if you are calling an entity a low-risk distributor, does it really behave like a low-risk distributor? or does he also undertake strategic functions which are not similar to how low-risk distributors operate? If you call somebody a contract manufacturer, does he have functions which are market-facing? Because contract manufacturers should not have market-facing functions. So, if the conduct of the parties is aligned with the form in which the transactions operate, then again those such transactions should not be disregarded. At best, the tax authorities can dispute the pricing and they can reprice the transaction, but should not disregard it. OECD has also explained that just because comparable instances are sometimes not found in real life, that is not a reason for disregarding a transaction by itself. Because very often related parties do undertake transactions which are not seen in real life. But that does not mean that those transactions are bad, necessarily bad or designed to avoid taxes. So in such situations, the test to be applied is that one needs to hypothesize that is this a transaction that independent third parties would be expected to undertake, if not actually undertaken. Okay, and that goes back to the same points that we talked about, options realistically available, business reasons, and so on. These three questions will answer the question that would independent third parties have actually behaved in a similar way, in a commercially rational way. The other test which OECD says is that the transaction in the manner in which it is actually undertaken between taxpayers, whether that transaction is capable of being transfer priced properly. So you may not find a comparable, but is there a way to transfer prices appropriately? And if there is a way to transfer prices appropriately, then again, you should not disregard this kind of a transaction. So that's really, I think if you look at our own law, some of these conditions are implicitly enshrined in the 4 conditions of GAR. So if you really see the jurisprudence, before GAR was enacted, you had all these rulings, Azadi Bachao Andolan and so on, which essentially said that as long as the transaction is legal, or in other words, it's not illegal, as long as the transaction is not a sham, tax authorities are not entitled to ask you, why did you undertake this transaction? All right, and whether a transaction is legal or not is easily established. You can establish that. But what do you really mean by sham? Sham essentially means non-est, and it's a question of conduct. That if you call yourself a contract manufacturer, and I'm talking of it in the TP context, if you call yourself a contract manufacturer, your conduct should be similar to that of a contract manufacturer. If it is not, then the transaction is something which can be regarded as a sham. So these were the principles which were enshrined in our own law. The way GAR has sought to change these principles is that in addition to these 2 tests, that whether the transaction is legal and whether it's a sham, you now need to also satisfy the test of business rationale. So prior to the insertion of GAR, tax authorities were not entitled to ask you this question, that why did you undertake this transaction? But now, after GAR becomes effective, there's a 3rd test that they can actually ask you that why did you undertake this transaction? And again, it goes back to the thing of options realistically available, because if you document these 3 things, you will automatically be able to document a good defense against GAR. The other point that I want to just highlight here, which is a very subtle nuance which a lot of people do not really think about, is if you see our Indian transfer pricing code, the way it is written, keep aside GAR for the time being, because GAR fundamentally changes a lot of things. But if you see the Indian code, the way it is written, section 92 to 92E is a machinery provision. Okay, so it says that where income arises from an international transaction, the income has to be computed having regard to the arm's length price. So 92 to 92E is a computation provision, and it 92 to 92 is a computation provision, and it requires that if there is a transaction and if income arises from that transaction, then it should be computed applying arm's length principles. The point over here is that the manner in which the TP code is written, it seems that there is no power to recharacterize, but only power to reprice. Okay? But if you compare and contrast 92.1, which is our arm's length standard, with let's say Article 9 of the treaty, you will see that the language of Article 9 is exceedingly vast. It says where conditions are made or imposed between related parties that differ from those that would have been entered into between third parties, then the tax authorities can change the reprice, etc., etc. And the words used are conditions made or imposed, which is significantly larger than saying compute income having regard to the arm's length price. So the test under Article 9 is significantly wider, and under Article 9, the treaty actually gives the right to recharacterize transaction. But if you are under the Income Tax Act, pending the application of GAR, currently there is no power to recharacterize transactions. Authorities can still do it, but you can say that, look, our TP law does not give you that power as yet. You can reprice the transaction but not recharacterize it. Should we go through this? Because I think we are running short of time.
We can have another 5 minutes if you
Okay, so I'm going to skip these case studies, but these case studies deal with the same examples that I gave you, where you have company A, which is an entrepreneur manufacturer, which owns IP. It is currently exporting to foreign companies who are engaged in distribution. The company seeks to restructure itself. It sets up an export hub outside of India, which is Company Z. And this export hub takes entrepreneurial responsibility for the export market. So Company Z has now the head and brains to manage exports and sales in global markets. And Company A's job is reduced to that of a contract manufacturer. So what's happening over here is that the entrepreneurial functions of managing sales in the global markets are actually migrated from A to Z. And likewise, the commercial right to exploit the intangibles in the export market is also shifted from A to Z. This is again something which we see is happening more and more frequently in real life, where Indian companies, as they are becoming more and more global, actually have evolved in a manner that they have decentralized operations outside of India. They acquire these new companies outside of India, and those new companies assume functions of managing those territories outside of India. So if decision making relating to export markets is actually happening outside of India in companies that you've acquired, then is there really economic merit in continuing to keep entrepreneurial profits of exports in the Indian territory? And that's really the driver for some of these restructuring that we see Indian MNCs undertaking. We've talked about this. How does the restructuring operations make sense for company A and Z? What is the commercial rationale? What are the expected benefits from restructuring from company A to Z? Would independent parties agree to similar relocation of functions, assets and risks? Are there any realistic options available to company A? Does company Z have decision-making capability and can assume and manage the risk it is allocated? Does company Z have capabilities to assume and manage IP ownership? Is any comparable uncontrolled data available in the public domain? So these are all the same questions we discussed in the past 1.5 hours. Would the restructuring give rise to compensation payment if the parties were independent? Is there transfer of assets, including intangible assets? Does company A have the right to compensation? Let's move ahead now. So what are the good things and the bad things emanating from the OECD guidelines? One is that the good things are that tax authorities are expected to respect commercially rational restructuring transactions that have substance. So you should not disregard those transactions completely. Restructuring may be disregarded only in exceptional situations. Again, we talked about this earlier. If there is non-arm's length behavior, then that non-arm's length behavior should be dealt with through pricing corrections and not by redrawing all the lines. Okay. And again, restructuring has to be evaluated not from a group perspective, but at the level of each legal entity independently. Post-restructuring transactions have to be addressed under normal transfer pricing rules. So you have to look at the functions and assets and risks of the post-restructured entities, what they are, and then you have to assign the right reward for that. And even